This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast, brought to you by Goldrock Capital. Each week, we look at how high net worth families can improve their lives, decisions, and investments in a deeply uncertain world. We always aim to provide practical information, even if we can't offer specific investment advice. Welcome, everybody, to the Definitely Uncertain podcast. My name is Darren Rockman, and I am a partner at Goldrock Capital, the 20-year-old family office servicing families with wealth in Israel and around the world. And today, with me on the podcast, Professor Benjamin Bental. Welcome, Professor Bental. Nice to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Professor Bental holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Haifa. He's been a visiting professor at many prestigious universities around the world, including the University of California at San Diego. And today, he is the Economics Policy Program Chair at the Taub Center, a leading economics and social think tank based in Jerusalem, where he looks at Israeli economics, particularly from a macro perspective. And so we thought that we would bring Professor Bental onto the show in order to talk a little bit about the economic situation in Israel today, 17 months into post the corona outbreak at the beginning of 2020. So, Professor Bental, how is Israel faring since COVID economically?
Well, have you asked me a few months ago, I would have said terrible. Now I said actually surprisingly well. So the economy has been through a really hard shock and has recovered remarkably well and remarkably quickly. So this is sort of summing up the situation as it is right now.
What are some of the data points that you're looking at that give you that picture?
So there are two issues, of course, that the macroeconomist looks at foremost. The first is growth rate of GDP. And the second is, of course, the employment situation. And again, on both fronts, Israel is doing much better than expected by many international bodies. So if we think about economic growth, the year 2020 actually didn't end that badly. We had a loss of something like 2.2% of GDP. Of course, in Israel, one has to take into account population growth. So in terms of per capita growth, this is roughly speaking 4%. But we are now basically back to the level that we have been at the eve of the pandemic. So after, of course, I mean, we have lost a year and a half in this sense, but it is much quicker than the rate that the OECD has predicted for us, for example.
Okay. So this is, and how does that compare to other Western countries, other OECD countries?
So again, we're doing better than most. As I say, remarkably well.
Okay. What explains the recovery? You know, what's driven the rebound?
So I think the big secret of the Israeli economy is, of course, its high-tech sector. So the high-tech sector has not suffered much during the pandemic. As a matter of fact, some subsectors of that sector has even grown, and this has kept the economy rather on a nice pace, as I say, also during the pandemic, and helps a lot in the rapid growth. And the other thing is what Israel doesn't have, a lot of tourism. So the countries that have been mostly and most badly hit are those for which the tourism industry is a major industry. So from that point of view, we have been luckily failing to attract a lot of tourists to Israel.
Right. Okay. And so when you think about sectors, so you say the high-tech sector has done well. What other sectors have fared well, and what are those sectors that are still suffering or have suffered?
Well, I mean, basically, so if you look at the service sector, the financial service sector, has also not suffered a lot, right? I mean, that is quite natural. That's probably similar to what happened in other countries in the world. These sectors could quickly adjust to work from home and circumvent the difficulties of the coronavirus. What has been suffering a lot, and we're coming back to tourism, right? Are all these sectors that are in, sort of engaging people on a one-to-one service, so accommodation, hotel services, and the like, and they have not yet recovered.
Right. Okay. So if we sort of switch now to one of the other things that we've seen throughout the last year and a half, and that has been the impact on Israel's currency on the shekel. Where we've seen, following initially the shekel depreciating and moving higher, it got to around 3.8 for a very, very short period of time. It then sort of settled around the 3.2 and a half range, where it's been now for some time. What explains the behavior of the shekel, and to the extent to which you're able to look further out, what should we expect from here on?
Yeah, so of course, I mean, the short-term surge that was, I think, roughly speaking, at the April or something like this, 2020, this is when, of course, when the panic was at its height, and it wasn't clear whether the pandemic will also turn into financial crisis, which it didn't, luckily, all over the world, right? So compared to 2008, of course, we are in a very, very different situation with respect to the financial sector. The Bank of Israel, and like many other central banks at that point in time, interfered and intervened in the markets very aggressively and very successfully, and calmed down the panic that started developing in the financial sector, in the financial markets, in particular with respect to foreign exchange. And that brought down the rate again to around the levels that you have been talking about. And of course, the culprit for that, because it is a culprit, I mean, we have an extremely strong shekel, is again the high-tech sector. So there is an enormous amount of money flowing into the economy, or even more so in 2021 than ever before. And of course, that exerts huge pressure on the exchange rate, to the detriment, of course, of other exporting elements of the Israeli economy. The other thing that contributed to that was that the crisis in 2020 manifested itself mainly by a plunge in consumption, and a lot of consumption is imports. So import went down dramatically, and of course, so you have this double-edged sword coming in. On the one hand, the high-tech sector exports not coming down. On the other hand, of course, the import plunging, and that, of course, again creates this situation that you are describing. I think this is with us to last for quite some time.
Okay. One thing you didn't mention there was Israel's offshore gas finds. How is that playing into the exchange rate, if at all?
Very little. Okay. So there was a big hype on that in the 2018 or something like this. I remember that even I myself said this is going to change things. I take it back. So the impact of the energy sector on what is going on in Israel is not tremendously big. And again, it is mainly these huge foreign investments in the high-tech sector that are playing a major role in this.
Okay. And when you say this is here to stay, what does that mean? Does that mean that again, I know that nobody can really accurately predict exchange rates, or if they do, they tend to be throwing darts at a dartboard. But is the strength of the shekel something which sort of sits around the area that is this the new normal, 3.2, or do we expect it to strengthen further as time goes on?
Well, of course, it depends a lot on what the Bank of Israel is going to do. So the Bank of Israel, of course, is keeping an eye on this and doesn't allow the the shekel to appreciate even further, which it might have without the Bank of Israel major interventions in the foreign exchange market. So if you think about the sort of implicitly, the Bank of Israel targeting the exchange rate at around the rate it is right now, number one. Number two, that again, that the trend in the high-tech sector seems to never abate. Then for the foreseeable future, I think this rate at which we are right now will be maintained. Okay,
understood. All right. So that's interesting. Now let's talk to one of the other points that you said was majorly impacted by COVID, which was the Israeli workforce. So how has the Israeli workforce changed over the last 2 years? Who's going back to work? Who remains unemployed? What do you see going forward?
Okay, so I said actually that this is the other front where Israel did quite well. So we are at a peak of an unemployment rate that was approaching 40% of the labor force. I mean, counting everything, right? People who were laid off due to the corona crisis in March and April of 2020. So that was a huge shock. And as a response to that, the government has introduced its famous leave of absence program, where people were paid basically unemployment compensation when they were laid off due to corona. And that program lasted until June of 2021 and had a major impact on the recovery of the labor force, the labor market, sorry. And sort of people were sort of, taking their time in returning to work. But once this program started sort of losing its impact, everyone knew that it was over by the end of June. We saw a rapid return of people to the labor market. The situation right now is that we have sort of a broad unemployment rate that consists also of people who have been impacted by the corona crisis of around 8%. So this is, of course, much higher than the 3.5% with which the labor market entered this corona crisis. But it is right that if you think about the 40% of March and April of 2020, this is a far cry. And of course, what we have is a residual unemployment, which has a lot to do with what we've been talking about before, namely that there are sectors in the economy that have not recovered. And indeed, when you look at the composition of the unemployed persons, you see mainly people who were engaged in these sectors, and of course, younger people, less educated people. And this is going to be a problem. It will last some time before the labor market readjusts and maybe some of these activities return to sort of at least reasonably high levels, let's say within a year or so.
Okay, so when you put all that together, you start to think about the impacts on wealth inequality in Israel from this crisis. You identified two sectors which have done well, high tech and finance. Obviously, there are others. Those tend to be the higher paying sectors within the economy. And then on the other hand, the sectors which are lagging, tourism, some of the service sectors, those tend to be sectors where even before the crisis, wages were relatively low, and people were struggling to make ends meet. So, how does Israel fare? Our Gini index. How do we fare going forward? Considering the impact that I just described.
Yeah, and so the situation that you have been describing, of course, existed also before the pandemic, and like situation in many other countries, the pandemic has really accelerated processes that were in place already during the teens of the 21st century. So there is a technological change. Automation is replacing labor in many sectors. And there is a restructuring going on. of course, this pandemic, again, has accelerated all of that quite a bit. And this is a problem that needs to be faced not only in Israel, but everywhere in the world. Israel may have more of a problem in that respect because there is not only an educational issue here, but also a, how shall I put it, a social background issue, because there is a high correlation between low education, low income on the one hand, and where you come from on the other. So if you're a Haredi Jew on the one hand, or if you are an Arab, in particular an Arab woman on the other hand, you are less well prepared for the labor market. And of course, these people will have to, I mean, the impact of this crisis on them is much bigger than it is on the sort of typical Jewish population in Israel. And of course, the government has a big task of re-educating and retraining, in particular, these segments of the population in order to prepare them for the new labor market.
So, okay, it becomes a sectorial issue, which obviously has not only economic impacts, but also social impacts in dividing the various sections of Israel apart. Is the government aware enough? What are they starting to do in order to solve some of these issues?
Well, at least this, okay, so we have been in a political stalemate, right, for quite some time, and it has coincided, unfortunately, with this crisis. So everyone in the political scene and outside the political scene is, of course, well aware of all of these issues. So that's not the question of awareness. The question is indeed of taking steps to correct some of these distortions. So one step that the current government has already taken, it is sort of a little bit willy-nilly and a little bit not enough, is to encourage Haredi men to join the labor market earlier than it used to be by reducing the exemption age from the army service. So this is, of course, something that may have a short-term effect because this step has been taken and is in effect as of now. Of course, dealing with the longer-term issues, in particular in the Arab sector, this takes time and this takes a lot of money and a lot of goodwill. So some of the money exists and has existed. Some of the goodwill existed also before, but the implementation was lagging and was really, really weak. And the question is, of course, that this is a big, big test for any government, right? The current or the future governments is really to implement the programs that have been accepted and have been sort of agreed upon some years ago.
So the programs, the government knows what it needs to do. It's even allocated the money, but you're saying it actually hasn't gone and taken the steps required to get the money to work.
That's right. The implementation is not, far from being perfect. Let's put it this way.
What were those plans, or what are those plans? What needs to be done?
So if we talk about the Arab sector, right? So again, the Haredi sector, this is a hot potato also politically,
sure.
Right? And again, so as I said, the government, this current government is a little bit less tied to old policies and tries to change. So it also it's not an easy task, of course. With respect to the Arab sector, the issue is really complex because what one needs is sort of the people from that community to be able to really make use of the resources that government is putting into in their disposal. And this is an issue also of public administration and competencies at the local level that seem to be lacking. There seems to be some movement in that direction, but again, this is a hard process because it involves so many people and so many institutions, and putting everything and coordinating all of these issues is not going to be a simple task. And of course, part of it is also, the things that are on the agenda all the time, which is crime in the Arab sector,
Sure.
And again, governability. So all of that are huge tasks, but again, there is growing awareness. There is a growing middle class in the Arab sector. So things are moving. They're moving slowly, but they're moving.
Okay. What is the impact medium to long term? Let's talk about 10 to 20 years from now. If these problems, which are systemic and obviously multifaceted, both in the Arab-Israeli sector and in the ultra-Orthodox sector, the Haredi sector, what is the impact should these not be solved? And should the current situation continue out for the next couple of decades?
No, the current situation is not sustainable. So we are looking at if everything continues as it is right now, right, and no dynamic changes take place, then Israel will find itself in 20, 30 years from now, basically being thrown out of the OECD. So if I don't know whether the OECD has an instrument of throwing out the country, but it will find itself at really at the bottom of this pile, and far behind. So where the standard of living is concerned, where everything, right, where the efficiency of government is concerned, where know-how is concerned. So the high-tech sector cannot carry this burden. So we are talking about something in particular because of the fast growth of the Haredi population. And indeed, the Bank of Israel is already incorporating this development into its growth forecast for Israel. That again, the dire sort of vision that you have now sort of put in front of me, this is something that is frightening. And therefore, right, again, everyone is aware of that. So one can only hope that people have eyes, right? They see that, and therefore, after all, the corrective steps that already start to be implemented will be enhanced, and we're not going to face this dire future.
Right. Well, as you and I are recording this 2 days before Yom Kippur, I think that's a good prayer for the new year and beyond. I want to ask you one other question as we sort of round off this discussion on macro in Israel. What about government debt and government deficit? Obviously, the government ran up a big debt during the pandemic period. How sustainable is that? I think some of the concerns early on is, Israel, we're a small country. We can't afford to be burdening ourselves with significant debt. How do you view this?
Okay, actually, here we are. I'm a bit of a maverick. Actually, I'm in the process of writing a paper on that together with Tzvi Eckstein, which sort of opposes a little bit this kind of standard view. First of all, one has to remember, right? Israel entered again this crisis in this respect a comfortable situation with a debt to GDP ratio of 60%, which is really very, very reasonable. The deficit was a bit high, and indeed, had the pandemic not occurred, the process was towards reducing it. The pandemic, of course, again, necessitated huge government intervention, and the deficit jumped to something like 11.5% of GDP, which again, compared to other OECD countries, is okay. Let's put it this way, right? So it's not an outlier.
And so where does Israel's debt sit today?
So again, the current budget is talking about 6.5, if I remember correctly, for 2021 and 3.9 for 2022.
Okay.
And actually, we argue that this is too ambitious. And now I'll try to explain why. The interest rate environment that Israel is facing, actually all governments in the world, all major governments in the world is facing, is extremely comfortable. So we're talking about something around 1% a year when we talk nominal. So I said that Israel is facing a very, very comfortable interest rate environment, similar to other major governments. So we have the interest rate right now stands at around 1% a year. So if you think about a growth rate of 3.5%, which was the usual growth rate of Israel during normal times, and it will be higher during the recovery, then the burden that this creates on the Israeli economy is, of course, not very big. So the idea that we try to promote is to say, look, where Israel is really, really lagging behind is infrastructure. And this is a responsibility of government. So public infrastructure, in particular transportation, right? So again, everyone who lives in the Tel Aviv area faces this situation, and it becomes worse and worse from day to day. In Haifa, it's not as bad yet, where I live. But Tel Aviv is the economic center of Israel, and this creates very large costs. So investment in the infrastructure, and of course we're talking about a rapidly growing population, is something that is absolutely necessary. And at an interest rate of 1% a year, you want to invest. So that's why I think the debt situation is not a source of concern. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the international capital markets, in particular the CBC, right? So this is a risk measure that is available through it's sort of an insurance cost measure that is available in that is traded in international markets. So you see that the confidence at the Israeli national debt is very high, despite everything, right? Despite Iran and despite the Hezbollah and despite Hamas and despite everything. So this is an opportunity.
Right. Okay. Well, that was really fantastic. I must say I both enjoyed and learned a lot out of that discussion. So, Professor Bental, thank you very much for sharing your time with us and your wisdom with us. And we look forward to having a healthy and happy new year. Wish you and your family as well up there in Haifa, or Haifa as we call it.
And sorry?
Up in Haifa, or as we call it. So a happy new year to you, and thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me again, and it was a real pleasure.
Okay, great. And to all you listening, again, Happy New Year, and look out for more episodes soon wherever you listen. Thanks very much, and goodbye.